So in this last set of slides in this section, I'm going to pull out some of the selects of how to work with grids, and kind of techniques and tips for kind of setting the grid up so that you can then be really dynamic with it, and what to consider when you are thinking about how to set your grid up. So I love particularly that this example is for a catalog that sells floor tiles, carpet tiles that are in fact square. So it fits really, really well that you're going to use a grid to sell something that's a grid. So if you think about your piece as a modular set of floor tiles that you can mix and match things out of depending on the needs that you have, you can think about the fact that we're not actually carpeting a floor, we're creating design. So unlike a carpet, which would look really weird to have a section in the middle that's empty, sometimes we need places for our eyes to rest in our design. So don't feel like you have to fill every single square in your grid. Be very, while you want to be rational in terms of how you lay it out, and by rational I mean like mathematically rational, that doesn't mean that you have to actually fill every single part of the space. So this particular piece, it's from it's not a magazine, it's a catalog for selling floor tiles. It's called Floor is the name of the product. I think they're still around. I remember they were really big in the kind of first decade or so of the 20th century. 21st century, whatever century we're in right now. And they're using this really ordered structural piece. But in the last set of spreads, they used up all of the space, right? And it was really like full and dense looking, very maximalist. But as you get further in, when you're looking at specific elements, you can see that there is white space. There is place for your eyes to rest. And so that way you can actually take in how the pieces are being used in the actual locations. So that way you can kind of play with that sense of space and you can see how it actually works. A bit like, as you can see in the upper right hand corner, you can set your floor tiles in the middle and let your hardwood floors underneath shine through. So considering leaving some white space and leaving a place for your eye to rest, think about creating an oasis. Places, I said earlier about, and when we're looking at the restraint project, thinking about the fact that white space we actually think of as luxury. Again, these are resting spots. These are places for the eye to take a breath, and it actually gives the images or the text or whatever design elements you have in the rest of the space, your positive space, it gives them more emphasis because of the negative space around it. But really consider that negative space and think about how it's used in the relationship between the elements. If it's haphazard, then it's not going to look really strong. So allow your pieces of design to shine by giving them negative space, but make sure it's considered. And again, this is for a place which is doing upscale architecture. So again, the architecture they want to shine, but they want the design to have an architectural feel to it as well. So if you're making modular modern architecture design floor tiles, you're probably going to want to use a modular modern approach to your design as well. But in this case, allowing that breathing room, it's almost like having the windows in the architecture that make things seem larger than they really are. Which kind of leads into letting the images shine. So when you have images as well as text, consider the relationship and how much emphasis you want placed on each. This white space here allows both the image and the text to stand really strongly on their own so that you don't feel like one is subordinate to the other. Neither one detracts from the other. This is from the same piece. So remember that you're going to need to set out amount of space for different things. Sometimes there's going to be the case where, as you can see in this case, the image needs to be really strong and stand on its own. And what's the emphasis? So in this case, we've got text referring to the specific photo, art, diagram. So it's going to make sense to the reader to see the image first, and then you understand it. You're not going to want to read about it and then look at it, because then that's going to color how you understand the image. You want to see the image on its own first, form your own ideas, your own understanding, and then see what other people say about it. Thinking about scale as well. So again, sometimes you want to focus in on a detail. Sometimes you're going to want to see something full size. So think about the relationship between the different elements. Now, thinking about the playing with space, playing with being creative once you've got your grid set. If you've got those solid underpinnings, you can more fluidly move between different pieces. You can move between pieces where the image needs to be foregrounded and the text needs to be background, where they need to stand as equals, where the text needs to be foregrounded. And sometimes when you're doing a design, like say a magazine, you're gonna need to play between these things. You're not gonna be all one or all the other. If you've got a really strong structure on which to build, then you can kind of go back and forth between these things a lot more easily than if it's kind of haphazard throughout. It takes you a lot more time, effort, and thinking if you don't have something strong underpinning your design and your choices, because then you're going to have to make new choices every single time, and it's going to require a lot more thinking and a lot more kind of follow through. Whereas if you've got a strong structure and everything follows the structure, you can play within it, and it will support lots of different kinds of text. So here we are again. I know I'm playing favorites. Marianne Bantes plays with formality a lot and with obviously text. I talked a lot about the fact she's a really great typographer. So she's paying attention to formal typographic detail here. So she's got consistent letter and word spacing and typefaces that are from a very specific time period. But because of the way that she plays with them, they look really sharp. So again, we're talking about 1963, we're talking about the 60s. There's a specific time that this wants to reference, but it still looks very contemporary. Then we get, again, 1962, different person. So this is a quote from her about talking about craft and typography. I work with visual alignment. I can get pretty fanatical about this, making sure there's some structure in the piece. I'll align things with parts of imagery or strong verticals and headlines, and I'll fuss and fiddle a lot to make sure it works out. I'm also fanatical about logical structure, hierarchy of information, and consistency. I believe that design and typography are like a well-tailored suit. And the end to the part about the well-tailored suit, I thought I had included it, but I hadn't. But you don't notice the little details that make it work really well, but you notice anything that's wrong. So if it works right, you don't notice it at all. And I think that's a really important thing about typography, is that it just fits. It's just perfect. And that's why it's like a well-tailored suit. So we can use weights and measures as a way to make it easier on you to figure out, when you're starting off especially, how to position things, how to have things take up like what percentage of the page, etc. So if you kind of set up a grid and you know that everything is going to fall into some part of that grid, it makes it easier for you, and then you can play with it, you can vary it, and you can kind of mess around with things, but it's within the structure, so you know that it's always going to look okay when you come back to it at the end. So here we have a multi-column grid, and it's for, again, you'll notice that there's a lot of these where you've got like performing arts centers. You're going to have to set a lot of information if you're going through a whole season. So again, we use color, we use weight, and we use kind of structure in order to make it interesting and dynamic while focusing on the kind of key most important elements. And there's a lot of info in there, but you'd be able to find what you're looking for pretty easily. You can use both vertical as well as horizontal hierarchies. So as you can tell from a lot of these, we're thinking a lot about columns, but remember our rows as well. They're important just as much. So we've got horizontal and vertical grids, and you can play with the relationship between them in order to make something look really interesting and dynamic, as well as being very useful and utilitarian. So just to remind you to always build in surprise. So again, we're using that grid structure, but the way that we deploy it can still be really visually interesting. So here we've got a tidy, almost Swiss approach. We got very clear information. Tidiness is good. Clarity is good. Going beyond the solution is great. So we've got a well-ordered grid, vertical columns, a readable system, but we can modify it. So then when we're going to another page, we can kind of play with the elements a bit. So we've got a lot of information in this particular example. So a grid's going to add clarity, authority, but with the variations are what makes it interesting. So if we've got a really good grid, you can diversify your page layouts. You can decide, all right, I'm going for this kind of a look on this page because this is the information I need to talk about. And it's coherent throughout the whole piece. So in this case, we've got kind of a 3-column system. So some cases, just a title. But in other cases, there's a lot of information, lists with heads and subheads. And you can support all of that in the structure. And it leaves room for things like oases for the eye. So a strong grid underpinning can support a lot of layouts, lots of variation, and in this case we can see this is from the cover. So I'm going to leave you with the last kind of couple thoughts. So thinking about the piece as a whole, thinking globally, thinking about the cover straight through to your index page, thinking about all the different kinds of information. This kind of goes straight back to the beginning about thinking about your plan before you jump in. And if we have all of these layers of information, it can make it visually interesting to the reader because you can make it a lot of contrast between those levels of information. And it also makes it easier on you. And it allows you to think about how you're going to combine these elements in a way that's really interesting. So remember that no matter what, information has to be readable. In order for us to do our job right, you have to communicate. Open space, places, oases for your eye to rest, really great for making your composition succeed, but they need to be well considered. Don't fill every pixel, every pica, every space. Don't fill the entire thing. Allow for those oases, but make sure that they're built into your design so that they feel like they're part of that whole. That's what I mean by thinking globally, thinking about the entire piece from beginning to end, including the covers.